It started as just another ordinary evening at the local grocery store. The aisles were filled with shoppers, some rushing to grab last-minute ingredients, others taking their time, comparing prices, and making careful selections. Among them was an elderly couple, Walter and Margaret, who had been married for over 50 years. They moved slowly but deliberately, their love evident in the way they supported each other. Walter held the basket, while Margaret carefully picked out fresh produce, occasionally holding up an apple or a tomato for his approval. They weren't wealthy, but they had enough to live comfortably, enough to share warm meals together, and enough to extend kindness whenever they saw someone in need. And that evening, as they waited in line at the checkout, they noticed something that tugged at their hearts. A young mother stood a few places ahead of them, her little boy clinging to her coat. She looked anxious, her eyes darting toward the cashier as she fumbled through her worn-out purse. One by one, she started putting items back: milk, eggs, a small bag of rice. Her face flushed with embarrassment. The total was still too high. She let out a small sigh and reached for the loaf of bread, hesitating before reluctantly placing it aside. Walter and Margaret exchanged a knowing glance. Without a word, Walter gently squeezed his wife's hand and stepped forward. "Mom," he said softly, his voice warm and kind. "Please, let us take care of that for you." The young woman turned to them, startled. Her eyes glistened with emotion as she shook her head. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly." Margaret interrupted her with a gentle smile. "It's all right, dear. We've had our fair share of hard times too." She patted the woman's hand reassuringly. "Think of it as a little kindness passed along." The cashier, sensing the moment, held off scanning the rest of the items, while the woman hesitated, but after a few seconds, overwhelmed with gratitude, she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, wiping her eyes quickly before her little boy could see the tears. Walter paid for her groceries without hesitation, and as the mother gathered her bags, she turned to them once more. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "This means more than you know." Margaret simply smiled. "Just take care of yourself and that little one." The mother walked away, her child skipping happily beside her, completely unaware of the weight his mother had been carrying. Walter and Margaret watched them go, their hearts full. They hadn't done it for recognition or praise. They had done it because it was the right thing to do. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have possibly foreseen, was that their simple act of kindness was about to lead to something truly unexpected. As they turned back to their own groceries, they barely noticed the man standing behind them in line. He had witnessed everything, the way they had stepped in without hesitation, the warmth in their voices, the way they had reassured the struggling mother with nothing but kindness. He had seen a lot in his life, but there was something about this moment that struck him deeply. The man was well dressed, his suit pressed neatly, his shoes polished to perfection, but there was something else in his eyes, something thoughtful, almost nostalgic. He cleared his throat as the cashier rang up Walter and Margaret's groceries. "That was a really wonderful thing you did," he said. Walter chuckled, waving off the comment. "Just a small kindness, that's all." The man tilted his head slightly, studying them. "You do this often?" Margaret smiled. "Whenever we can." The man nodded slowly, as if turning something over in his mind. Then, just before Walter could reach for his wallet, the man did something that caught them completely off guard. "I'd like to return the favor," he said, pulling out his own card. "Tonight's groceries are on me." Margaret's mouth opened in surprise. "Oh no, that's not necessary. I insist," the man said, his tone gentle but firm. "Please, let me do this." Walter and Margaret glanced at each other. They had always been the ones giving, never expecting anything in return. But something about the sincerity in this man's eyes made them pause. Finally, with a soft chuckle, Walter nodded. "All right," he said. "Thank you." The man paid for their groceries, and as they gathered their bags, he extended a hand. "My name's Daniel," he said, "and I'd love to have a conversation with you both sometime. I think we might have more in common than you'd expect." Margaret and Walter exchanged another glance, curiosity flickering in their eyes. There was something about Daniel, something unspoken, something they couldn't quite place, and what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly anticipate, was that this single encounter was about to change their lives in a way they never imagined. Walter and Margaret left the grocery store with their bags in hand, but their minds were still lingering on the encounter with Daniel. There was something about him, something familiar, yet distant. He had spoken with warmth, yet there was a weight in his voice, as if he was holding back a part of his story. As they walked to their old sedan, Walter turned to his wife. "What do you think he meant, saying we might have more in common than we expect?" Margaret adjusted the strap of her purse. Her brow furrowed slightly. "I'm not sure, but did you notice the way he looked at us? Like he was searching for something." Walter nodded. He had felt it too, but before he could say more, they heard footsteps approaching behind them. "Excuse me," Daniel called out, jogging toward them. "I hope I'm not overstepping, but would you two have time for a cup of coffee?" Walter and Margaret exchanged glances. They had been planning to head straight home, but there was something about Daniel's expression. Earnest, almost urgent. They had trusted their instincts for decades, and right now, something told them this conversation was important. Margaret smiled. "We'd love to." They found a small cafe near the store, a cozy little place with the smell of fresh pastries and coffee in the air. They settled into a corner booth, and after placing their orders, Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I hope this doesn't sound strange," he began, "but when I saw what you did for that mother back at the store, it reminded me of something, a time in my life when I was the one struggling." Margaret tilted her head. "You?" Daniel nodded, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "You probably wouldn't guess it now, but I didn't always have this suit, or the success people assume I've had all my life. When I was a kid, my mother and I barely made it. She worked long hours, sometimes skipping meals so I could eat. There were nights we went to bed hungry." Walter and Margaret listened intently, their hearts already aching for the boy Daniel had once been. One evening, Daniel continued, "We were at a grocery store, just like today. My mom was doing the same thing, putting things back, trying to make the money stretch. I remember the embarrassment in her eyes. And then a couple stepped in." Margaret sucked in a small breath. Walter sat up a little straighter. "They told her not to worry, that they'd cover it, just like you did today." Daniel's voice grew softer. "I never forgot that moment. It wasn't just about the groceries. It was about the kindness, the way they made my mom feel, like she wasn't alone." Margaret's eyes glistened. "And you never saw them again?" Daniel shook his head. "No, but that moment shaped my entire life. I worked hard, got through school, built a business, and all along, I kept thinking about them, about the kindness they showed when we had nothing. I always wished I could find a way to thank them." Walter exhaled, his expression thoughtful. "So when you saw us tonight, it reminded you of them?" Daniel nodded. "Exactly. And it made me realize, kindness like that doesn't just disappear. It spreads. I wouldn't be where I am today if it weren't for that act of generosity all those years ago." He paused, looking at them both. "And that's why I can't just let this be a one-time meeting. I feel like I was meant to meet you two tonight, Margaret reached for Walter's hand under the table, squeezing it gently. There was an unspoken understanding between them. They had always believed in the power of kindness. But to sit here, listening to Daniel, it was like seeing the proof of it come full circle. Walter cleared his throat. Daniel, I don't know why we met tonight, but I do know this. Sometimes life brings people together for a reason. Daniel smiled, but there was something else in his expression. Something unresolved. There's one more thing, he admitted, his voice quieter now. Something I haven't told you yet, Margaret. And Walter waited, sensing the shift in his tone. I recently lost someone very important to me, Daniel continued. My mother. She passed away just a few months ago. He took a deep breath. She always talked about the couple that helped us that night. She never stopped wondering who they were. And before she passed, she told me something I'll never forget. He swallowed hard, his emotions evident now. She said, if you ever meet people with hearts like that, don't let them go. Hold on to them. They're the kind of people who make the world a better place. A silence fell over the table. Margaret blinked back tears. Walter, always the steady one, reached out and placed a comforting hand on Daniel's shoulder. You were a good son, he said simply. Daniel let out a small, shaky laugh. I tried to be. He looked between them. And now. I don't know if this is crazy, but I feel like maybe I was meant to meet you two. Like maybe you could be part of my life, in some way. Margaret's heart swelled. Daniel, dear, kindness isn't just something you do once. It's something you carry with you. And I think your mother would be so proud of the man you've become. Daniel exhaled, a look of relief washing over him. Thank you, he whispered. Walter, ever practical, chuckled. Well, if we're meant to be in each other's lives, I suppose we should start with something simple. He slid a napkin across the table. Our number's on there. You ever need a home-cooked meal, you know where to find us. Daniel took the napkin, looking down at it like it was something priceless. I'd love that. But as they finished their coffee, none of them realized that this was only the beginning, that this meeting, this unexpected moment in a grocery store, was about to lead to something even bigger, something none of them saw coming. In the days that followed, Daniel kept his promise. He called Walter and Margaret just a few days later, and before they knew it, he was sitting at their small dining table, sharing a home-cooked meal that reminded him of his childhood, the warmth of their home, the gentle laughter between the couple, the way they spoke with such kindness. It all felt so familiar. Over time, their bond deepened. Daniel found himself visiting them more often, helping with small tasks around the house, taking them out for Sunday lunches, and even calling, just to check in. It was as if he had found something he didn't even realize he had been missing. And for Walter and Margaret, who had never had children of their own, it felt like life had unexpectedly given them a son. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Daniel hesitated before speaking. There's something I've been meaning to tell you both, he admitted. Something I've been thinking about for a while now. Margaret set her cup of tea down, sensing the weight in his words. What is it, dear? Daniel exhaled, looking between them. My mother always wanted to give back to the kind of people who helped us when we had nothing. And now that I have the means to do it, I want to honor her in the best way I can. Walter leaned forward. And how's that? Daniel smiled softly. I want to start a foundation in her name, a program that helps struggling families with groceries, bills, or whatever they need to get back on their feet. He paused, watching their reactions. And I want you two to be a part of it. Margaret gasped, covering her mouth. Walter blinked, stunned. You mean us? Daniel nodded. Who better? You two embody everything this foundation should stand for: kindness, generosity, and the belief that even the smallest act can change a life. Margaret reached for Walter's hand, her eyes glistening. "Oh, Daniel, that's beautiful." Walter chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. "We were just trying to help someone in need that night at the grocery store. And now you're telling us it's turning into something this big?" Daniel smiled. "That's the thing about kindness. It never really stops. It just keeps going." With Walter and Margaret's guidance, Daniel moved forward with his plans. Within months, the foundation was officially established, helping families in need, just as his mother had once been helped. Walter and Margaret became its heart, sharing their wisdom, meeting with the people it helped, and reminding everyone involved that generosity wasn't just about money. It was about compassion, about seeing others, about lifting each other up. As the foundation grew, so did their connection. Daniel no longer saw Walter and Margaret as just kind strangers. He saw them as family, and for the elderly couple who had spent a lifetime helping others, they had been given the greatest gift of all, a son they never expected, but had always wished for. One evening, as they sat together after another successful event, Daniel looked at them and smiled. "I think my mom would have loved you too," he said quietly. Margaret squeezed his hand, her voice full of warmth. "I think she's watching over you, Daniel. And I think she's incredibly proud." Walter nodded. "And so are we." As they sat there, under the soft glow of the evening sky, it was clear that what had started as a simple act of kindness had become something far greater. It had created a family. It had changed lives. And it had proven that sometimes the smallest gestures lead to the most unexpected and beautiful surprises.